Federal elections happen every 2 years in this country. Presidential elections every 4 years. And 4 years just isn't long enough to dismantle all the environmental laws we've got in this country. No candidate can win a presidential race advocating gay marriage and opposing the military action in Iraq. In 1800, in the first interparty contest, the Federalists warned that presidential candidate Thomas Jefferson, because of his sympathy expressed at the outset of the French Revolution, was the son of a half-breed Indian squaw, who would put opponents under the guillotine. For the entire 4 years of the greatest presidential term of our lifetime, Democrats led by Speaker Pelosi and radical socialists in her party attempted coup after coup against President Donald Trump. Nobody understood how to use television for his own purposes better than Nixon, despite his poor showing against John F. Kennedy in the televised presidential debate. The way we think about a presidential portrait is one that is imbued with dignity from the outset. Was Senator Barack Obama a Muslim? Did he ever practice Islam? The presidential candidate officially rejects the claims, but the issue of Obama's personal faith has re-emerged amid conflicting accounts of his enrollment as a Muslim during elementary school in Indonesia, the world's most populous Muslim nation. My legal bond with the AKP may have ended the day I took the presidential oath of office, but my bonds of love have never ended and never will. In a presidential campaign, you can't lie. You can't hide what you are and what you want. You can't hide what kind of president you'll be. You can't keep on talking about nothing indefinitely and committing to nothing. You can't keep running away from debate, masking the challenges. In 2006, I entered the presidential palace in the main square of La Paz as the first indigenous president of Bolivia. Our government, under the slogan, Bolivia Changes, is committed to ending the colonialism, racism and exclusion that many of our people lived under for many centuries. I perfectly understood President Obama's attitude throughout the French presidential campaign. He had no reason to distance himself from Nicolas Sarkozy. It's the basic solidarity that leaders who work together owe to each other. The 2012 presidential campaigns turn away from the classic, straight-up, American election, where the candidate who gets the most votes nationwide wins, is another sad reminder of the extreme political polarization distorting today's politics. No one talks about a 50-state strategy for winning the presidency these days. I debated in high school. If you told things that weren't true or just made things out of whole cloth, you were penalized. It's too bad they don't apply the same standards to presidential candidates as they do to high school students. Governorships and Senate seats are the most common stepping stone offices for presidential campaigns, and U.S. House seats are the most common stepping stone positions for statewide campaigns. I think you have to look at the fact that every presidential candidate, Republican or Democrat, has all said that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel and the embassy should be moved. President Trump's the only one that had the courage to actually do that. We have a presidential candidate who's deleted emails and done things illegally and is a presidential candidate. That doesn't make sense to me, because if that was any other person, you'd be in prison. So what is this country really standing for? Don't automatically obey presidential directives if you disagree or if you suspect he hasn't considered key aspects of the issue. But presidential approval also became a surrogate measure of national unity and patriotism. Political nature abhors a vacuum, which is what often exists for a year or two in a party after it loses a presidential election. Secret Service agents wear suits to blend in with presidential visits, not stand out. Obama is a tyrant the same way FDR was a tyrant. He has a view of presidential power that states, the government is in control of the country, and the president is in charge of the government. He's taken an imperial view of the presidency. Today, the most important political instrument in the hands of the opposition is the presidential veto. As someone who's been covering presidential campaigns since the 1950s, I have no delusions about political reporting. Candidates bargaining access to get the kind of news coverage they want is nothing new. Let's not overlook, though, what we do know about the campaign finance scandal, and the fact the Chinese were involved in our presidential campaign and our congressional campaigns. The people of South Carolina support conservatives who are trying to push real change, and the people of South Carolina expect their presidential candidates to back them up when they show courage. When you're the presidential nominee, you get to pick whomever you choose to be on the ticket, and that person gets to say yes or no because, obviously, it's a very important decision. All of the people who work in the Russian government and Russian presidential administration, in this way or another, work for Vladimir Putin. By the time a man gets to be presidential material, he's been bought 10 times over. If we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday at a time of presidential inaugurals, this is thanks to Ronald Reagan, who created the holiday, and not to the Democratic Congress of the Carter years, which rejected it. Stubbornness is a positive quality of presidential leadership, if you're right about what you're stubborn about. I think we may be seeing the beginnings of a resurgence of civic-mindedness in this country. Hopefully the younger generations, which came out in record numbers during the last presidential election, will pass their enthusiasm on to their children. In the 90s, there was scant presidential leadership and insufficient domestic political mobilization for foreign policy grounded in human rights. I, as Prime Minister, never went to Washington, certainly never went to a presidential ranch. I hate to say this, but I wasn't going to be the pilot fish to the shark, whereas Australia quite happily bobbed along like a happy little pilot fish with a shark who was a messy eater, and I just couldn't feel like that. I've always enjoyed reading history, particularly presidential biographies. Analysts may be correct that the presidential election won't primarily turn on entitlements reform, but by choosing Paul Ryan as his running mate, Mitt Romney can, contrary to conventional wisdom, make it a winning issue and lay the foundation for a reform mandate when he wins. Every presidential candidate highlights patriotism, but Mr. Romney's is backed by the Mormon belief that the United States was chosen by God to play a special role in history, its Constitution divinely inspired. Green is likely to be a big issue in the 2008 U.S. presidential election, largely in response to George Bush's suicidal refusal to engage with environmental issues. The weak economy, widening income inequality, gridlock in Congress and a presidential election, those were perhaps the dominant economic and political themes of 2012. What if Barack Obama established a presidential advisory committee that would meet once every couple of months, bringing together the former presidents for a conference in order to seek their collective wisdom? There is a wealth of experience in former presidents that generally goes untapped. Presidential elections and the voter experience have long been fraught for black people. From racist poll taxes to made-up literacy tests to the egregious rollback of voting rights over the past 50 years, American democracy has, at times, felt like a weird and failed social experiment. The fantasy world of movement conservatives is no longer fringe talk. The leading candidates for the Republican presidential nomination embrace it. They are playing to a chorus of true believers, and they are preaching what that choir wants to hear. They are following the same pattern Eric Hoffer identified as the path to authoritarianism. Americans must have faith that presidential election rules are established through the transparent, democratic process required by the U.S. Constitution to guarantee public accountability and preserve federalism. In the 2000 presidential election, Al Gore got more votes than George W. Bush, but still lost the election. The Supreme Court's ruling in Florida gave Bush that pivotal state, and doomed Gore to lose the Electoral College. That odd scenario, where the candidate with the most votes loses, has happened 3 times in U.S. history. Peter was never going to get into television because he was unattractive. He would either go into business school or become a lawyer or something professional like that. Then he asked a question of John McCain during the 2008 presidential campaign when he was in college. That single question changed the arc of his life. The 1980 Republican presidential contest might have been as good a roster of candidates as ever fielded by any party. How did abortion and birth control impact the congressional race of Dan Maffei and Anne-Marie Buerkle or the presidential race between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney? I don't know. But I think the so-called social issues were front and center in the minds of voters. These issues may indeed have lost the Republicans some elections. Consider this. The United States held its first presidential election in 1789. It marked the first peaceful transfer of executive power between parties in the fourth presidential election in 1801, and it took another 200 years' worth of presidential elections before the courts had to settle an election. The number of American presidential candidates varies with the sunspot cycle and the phases of the moon. Somebody asked me about the current choice we're being given in the presidential election. I said, well, it's like 2 of the scariest movies I can imagine. Presidential leadership needn't always cost money. Look for low and no-cost options. They can be surprisingly effective. Visit our website for more quotes, quoting.com.